Welcome to Professor Laura. I met her through the Taloy network. She's an engaged scholar from 2022, and she's guiding us. She's very wise and gives me very good advice. Reverend Chris is one of my community partners that's sitting in the meeting. So we're looking forward to your discussion. Please go ahead. Can you share the screen? Or do you want?
I will share the screen in a moment. I would just, Martina asked me to come and speak to this group after Martina and I had a long conversation about her wonderful work in the community. And we were talking about my project. I'm an anthropologist. I am based at Bard College in New York. And actually, my research has taken turns that were very, very unexpected, partially because of the pandemic and partially because of the nature of what the research was. I will say that I did not intend to do the kind of project that emerged. And that I think is part of what Martina was talking about. So I'll just share my screen. I have some PowerPoint slides. And before I do, I'll just say that my research that I've been doing lately is based in Kenyan, in a refugee camp, Kakuma refugee camp. But this is not my initial expertise. I have done research for many, many years in Nepal, and it was this research project that brought me to Kenya. So I'm kind of new to doing research in the African continent, I will say, and I'm very happy to speak to you. Let me just share my screen. I have two things to. Okay, actually, I'm going to start at the beginning here. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, or
perfect. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So the research that I am doing, I'm currently working on a book manuscript that is, the current title is Ear Witness on the Labor of Interpreters. And it is it has emerged into, I should say, an engaged research or participant action research. Martina and I were part of a seminar last week trying to distinguish these two. And I would say that this research project is part of both. The questions, and I will just sort of give you an overview of the research questions that started this project. I was interested in thinking about interpreters who work in the field. And this initially emerged from my research in Nepal, where the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights sent a mission to Nepal because of a civil war that was going on there between the state and the Maoists. And I was working on a book at the time, finishing a book at the time that was a very different subject, although it overlapped with this question of interpreters. I was focused on questions about voice, and I had a lot of research that I did about radio. And I met some people who were working for this mission in Nepal who described themselves as a voice for hire. And they started describing their work in the field as being a kind of transmitter, even though their work as a translator was quite involved. But the way that they were being thought of and the way that they themselves thought of themselves is as a sort of neutral medium conduit for moving between the UN officer and the local Nepali population. That was the beginning of this research project. So I asked, these are some of the questions. I'm going to just leave them up here. I don't have to read them all. But basically, I was interested in what happens subjectively when the medium for circulating these voices of global citizens is another human being whose labor is often imagined as the output of a machine. I realized in doing the initial research that I really didn't, because interpreters work in so many different places in the world, and there are so many different UN missions around the world, I didn't want this book to be solely located in Nepal. And it was through a series of connections that got through, not surprisingly, through Geneva, that got me to Kakuma refugee camp, where a group in Geneva had been training a group of refugees to become what they were calling humanitarian interpreters to work for the UNHCR in the camp. And I was all set to go. And as an anthropologist, typically what one does is a kind of community research like the type that Martina and some of you are involved in, ethnographic research that involves being in the space and having your questions emerge from what is important to the community that you're working with. So I was all set to go, and then I got my research permits and everything from Kenya in the beginning of March of 2020, and then the world shut down. And so my research had to change, and the funding agency basically said, you have to change your whole research and you can't go there. So that began this process of me taking. What's that? Oh, I think somebody has their sound on. That began the process of me transferring and transforming the money that I was going to use to travel into a much more, in some ways, a better use of those funds by working with the group in Kakuma virtually and actually having interpreters become sort of my research associates. And so first thing I did was I sort of hired in some ways. I became almost like my own personal NGO in a way, and this is not my background, but I got six interpreters who had worked regularly with UNHCR. I got them phones so we could connect, and then we began meeting on Zoom. And we began meeting on Zoom, and we had a lot of different activities. We'd meet twice a week. It was almost like a kind of class in a way. And they would do lots of different things. There were questions that I asked them, but they were also sort of guiding me in as I learned about what interpreting was like in the camp. This is during the height of the pandemic, and one of the activities they did was they wrote in these interpreters' diaries, which they would send to me, we would discuss, and these have to do with either questions that I had asked or things that they felt were important about their work as interpreters. Then they would get together and discuss questions. So it became almost a class for them, even though I wasn't there. And so this is them getting together and discussing. They were based at this compound, which was set up by the Geneva organization, and they ran a program there that was education for refugees more generally. It was not solely about interpreters. And that provided a space where they could meet, and that became clearly very, very important. So here are a couple pictures of this space. And then what happened was that this organization, InZone, I was trying to think as an anthropologist how to do this kind of engaged ethnographic research on Zoom, which is, really a hard task. And one of the things that the organization in Geneva had done was they had created these very short films about interpreting in the camp. And so here's a clip from one of these films. They were unfinished films, and I decided that I was going to show these films to the group I was working with on Zoom, and that we would discuss it. And this was one of the first films that I showed, and a Somali woman who is speaking to, this is somebody from the Geneva organization, and it's a sort of fictional film that they were going to use for teaching purposes. What ended up happening was that, here's another clip from this film, same film, where an interpreter, you can see this person is in the back here, and then the woman who is supposed to represent an INGO claims that she doesn't understand this woman, when in fact, as an audience member, an English speaker, you actually can understand her, calls this man over, and he begins to interpret for her. What ended up happening in showing these films, and here's another segment from that same film, is that the people I was talking with, everybody in this film they were also interpreters. And so that created this other dynamic where people who were watching recognized their colleagues. And some of those colleagues had been relocated. So there was like Ellie, who was in Utah, and there was somebody else who was in Toronto, and some of them had left the camp. Some of them were still in the camp. So we began to invite, because of Zoom, I think 2 of these people who are in the film, to join us on Zoom and to begin talking about the film and what it was like to be part of this film and what it was like to be interpreter. And this was largely on their initiative. They said, oh, we should invite these people to come in. So in the course of that conversation, those conversations, here's a last clip. Here is where we are all meeting and talking about it, and have invited some guests in to discuss it. So it became a very much more, in my view, a kind of ethnographic, because they were also talking about to each other, which was interesting. It was in the course of these discussions that one of the, or a couple of members said, we really should make our own film. And we know we've been doing this research. The other thing I guess I forgot to mention is that I also trained them, this group, to do interviews. We did an ethics course together, and they went out to find other interpreters who they themselves interviewed, and then would bring back, and I would talk with this person. So they were becoming active. They were research collaborators, really, in this project, and guiding me in terms of what was important. So in the course of watching these films, a couple of them said, we should do something ourselves. We should make our own film. And I was involved, as Martina knows, in this OSIN project, and had learned about a research fellowship for East African researchers. And I said to the group, you should apply for one of these fellowships and see if, because I don't have the money for a film, and none of us had any background in film. So even though I have taught with a filmmaker at Bard, and Bard actually has a very strong film department, I knew there were some resources from my end to help in this process, but we didn't have the money or the training. So what ended up happening was they got this OSIN grant, and the money went directly to them, and they became a group who actually went to film school for 6 months. And I was sort of an advisor for this film, but what they ended up doing, and in my advising role, and so what happened to my research is it completely transformed into watching this process of self-representation, of how do interpreters want to represent their work in a different kind of medium than I was going to be, I was going to be writing a book. They wanted to do this film. So I told them, I will be part of this journey with you, and that will become part of my research. And they were fine with that. And so they wanted to so one of the things I did was I brought in filmmakers. So these are 2 filmmakers who wrote a really beautiful film called Unwritten Letters, who I had been connected to, and they shared their film, and then we had a conversation about it. Down below, we can see that they're talking about the script. They wrote a script. The script is a fictional script. They felt it was important that this be a fictional film, even though it was based on their own work, as well as all the interviews that we had done. And it's a provocative film. So they, for reasons of protection, and also I would say reasons of, I think they were interested in making a fictional film. And there are many, many, many documentary films made in Kakuma refugee camp. I don't think they wanted to necessarily be part of that industry at that moment. And they felt, here's this opportunity. They wanted to write a film. So they wrote a script. We went over the script with many filmmakers. And around February of, so this project of filmmaking started in 2021, August or so. I had started working with them in January. So around August, they started going to film school. They wrote the script by January. January of 2022, we were meeting with lots of filmmakers to talk about the script. And then they were set for filming in February of 2022, and I finally had the opportunity to travel. So I became basically part of the crew, and then they assigned me a role in this film. So I then actually became a character in this film. And I thought I would share with you a 5-minute clip of the film, which is currently in the final stages of being edited and hopefully can be shown in different places. And then maybe we can reflect together on thinking about community research together and kind of the challenges that have occurred throughout this. So I have a 5-minute clip to share. Is that okay, Martina? I don't know where we are in terms of time.
Oh, it's perfect. And I will cut the 5 minutes out of the YouTube.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And then I had meant to do a little introduction to this. And I'm sorry about that. I'll just quickly say a few words about this. The interpreter who's being played is actually a member of our research collective. none of these people, actually the person playing the client is, I think, has acted before. Many people were not actors. But the interpreters who are employed in Kakuma are called incentive workers. You may have heard this term. It's a unique category of labor that some refer to as volunteer work. So for many refugees, incentive work is one of the only forms of paid labor, because legally in Kenya, refugees are not allowed to work in a salaried position because, as I heard, often refugees don't pay taxes. So, and they receive very, basic services for free from the UNHCR. But the UNHCR has developed these strategies that skirt around this law and led to refugee participation in camp governance. So incentive labor, which is the kind of work that these interpreters are doing, is one of these strategies. And as has been discussed in some of the literature, incentive work reveals what has been called the Janus-faced humanitarianism, like the two-faced Roman god. The same humanitarian organization can be both a protector and a transgressor of refugee rights. So I mentioned that they wanted to make a fictional script. They did not want a documentary or any other genre of the real. But as we worked on this, it became clear that fiction was what afforded the possibility of documenting the real. Kamoso, who is the director, had asked me to play this role of Sonia that you just saw, an imagined humanitarian officer. And this became my kind of participant observation. I had stressed to the group that I'm not a humanitarian officer or worker. But of course, this character made the most sense for me to play. And, you could see I was sitting there with a computer and a printer and a fan and a large water dispenser. So Sonia is, or I am, the only white character in the film. And just say a word about the title, which is called The Bridge, which conjures up the etymology in English of translation as a kind of carrying across. And bridges, are obviously central features of modern infrastructure. I would say interpreters are perhaps the critical infrastructure of humanitarian organizations. So in the film, in different scenes, we see these bridges are sometimes built up on the spot when there's a need, and they're also torn down when others lack the trust that that bridge will adequately carry their stories across. And then in other moments, like in the scene we just witnessed, the bridge itself crumbles under the weight of the words that must be carried across. So I guess I'll just end there by saying that this has been a very new type of research project for me, in part because, I have been incorporated into a project that they themselves want to create. And a group of them, there were 6 originally, and there were changes in who was working together, but a group of 3 of them who have been on this project from the very beginning have just recently started a community-based organization of their own, where they hope to make other films. And in fact, we'll be starting on a new film about incentive labor more generally, which I think is going to be a more documentary style film this summer, about, films going on in the camp. So I think Martina, is that okay? Should I leave it there?
Yes, I think so. And it's so exciting and new. I'm sure somebody would ask a question, because I found it very exciting. We always hear about the story, but didn't see it. And I see Joseph from Uganda is also here, Joseph. So at least, yeah. Is there anybody that would like to ask a question at this stage? Everyone is so amazed because we never thought of this. We are doing everything differently. What was your biggest challenge in the whole process? Was it the funding, or what was the biggest challenge that you, if we would like to do something similar, what advice would you give us?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that in some ways, I started off this project as a researcher and have ended in almost like a facilitator or something, in the sense that I, a lot of the work that I started doing was connecting what I felt might be useful for, they want this film to circulate much wider than just the camp. And so I felt in my capacity, I could connect them with people in my institution and others that I may know, to try to make it a film that would be legible outside of the camp, and that would be, people would want to see, even though it's a first film. It's a first film for all of us. So, there are challenges. So I think that for me, that was a big challenge. Then there were challenges in the sense that, a lot of this was going on from far away, and there's a lot that I don't know and a lot that they know. And, I'm very clear about the fact that there's a lot that I don't know. And I think that that is challenging because I'm, having to move and change things as I learn. There were definitely money challenges. There were money challenges among the group themselves, and I was not entirely privy to it. But when I got there, I did become privy to some of the challenges that they were having. And that was, that was something that I had to figure out how to manage, actually. And a lot of it, they, managed themselves. I mean, the whole film, they used the OSIN grant. They did all the budget. They did all the payment of the actors, all that. And I think that was a very important part of the project, because it was not, it wasn't me giving this, it was them organizing it. And so that was, important.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question, but I first want to hear if somebody has a question. I think Aubrey wants
Or
to
comment.
I do have a question.
Thank you.
Can I?
Please,
Yeah,
yes, please.
Thanks for such a informative presentation. I must say it's quite interesting to see how you do the research, and unique in one way or another. As researchers, sometimes when we go to not sometimes, actually, when we go to any site, really, we come with our own history, our own biases into that, and that we need to manage that carefully in terms of the whole process. Tell me, in terms of the film part, and you're linking that to your research, because when we act, I believe there's a lot of work done in terms of you don't just I would like to believe the same happened here. You had to rehearse, you had to cut and restart and all that in terms of making this particular film. So which aspect, in terms of your observation as a participant observer, that you take, and which is still natural as part of your research, not influenced by the film part of it in terms of editing and correcting and the whole process involving film? I'm not in film, but you'll know better. Thank you.
So, you mean in natural, in terms of what I saw, what we learned through interviews?
Yes, in terms of the interview, what you observe as a participant observer, or how do you make that distinction? Because you're playing two roles in a way there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I am playing two roles, and as I said, the fictional part of the film is that no character could be linked to the actual events in the film. Even though I would say every scene is linked very closely to the interviews that we did and that they did. And so, and then in terms of what I got out of being part of the film as a participant, I mean, I feel like in many ways, I wouldn't say that, but the most intense participant observation was this shoot of the film, because I was actually there and I could actually see a much wider range of what was going on in the camp through the different locations that we went to. So the participant observation part was very much just going along with them. We went to a house to film a scene at night. We went to, and that was set up, and then there were a lot of side comments. I mean, making a film involves an enormous amount of waiting time and reshooting and reshooting and reshooting. And so during that waiting time, I just would talk to people and I would learn about where we were in the camp. And we did a scene that's in a cinema hall. And so I saw, sort of the everyday life that was part of being in the camp. And I think that will be part of what I myself write about in some ways, which I'm in the process of doing. The fictional part of the film, which I think maybe your question is also asking about, is the story, really. It's a story with two characters who are made up characters, composites of different scenes from the interviews that we did. But it's very hard to read this film as a fictional film. It's the genre itself is a strange one. We did show a version of it on World Refugee Day, and it was introduced consistently as a documentary because it feels that way, because it's very connected to everyday life. I'm not sure if I'm answering fully your question, but I think that one of the interesting parts from my participant observation is seeing what the group wanted to represent and what they didn't want to represent.
Now, thank you. You did actually answer. It's quite complex, I can imagine, but thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Eugene. Aubrey?
Thank you, Dr. Martina. Thank you, Laura. Story collections are very important. In this particular research that you were doing, I pick up, not necessarily the documentary itself, but there's also a story that needs to be documented. Because writing and filming are two different things. In terms of story collections, you have, this narration that is passed on and recorded. But in filming, there is editing that actually chucks out, things that are not necessarily going to be very acceptable with the story itself. So don't you think of producing a book that would also, intertwine with the film itself? Because the documentary, you can have a 1 hour interview with someone, but only take 5 minutes out of that particular interview. And I also read a tear in this documentary. And a tear, I suppose, it's a story that needs to be told. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for that. Thank you for that question and comment. Yes, I think there does need to be a book that, we're in the process right now of figuring out how to make this film public? What is the best forum? What, who is the audience even? Is it academics, and should it be shown in classrooms? Is it people who are interested? We don't really fully know. So along with the film, we're in the process of doing a website right now. And in that website, we will be having things like the history of this film, and we will also we will have some discussion questions for people who want to use it as an educational form. I think in my own writing, I've gone back and forth between what you're suggesting, which is sort of a book that goes along with the film, that talks about what's edited out, talks about what we decided not to use, what they decided not to use, and what story we decided to go with. Or is it a chapter within my book that is a larger book about interpreters, right? And so maybe both. At this point, with my time limitations, I'm focusing on just the chapter right now, but I do think that it deserves a fuller picture. So, it's really about time constraints, I think, more than anything. Not that it, but all those questions that you raised are certainly things that I'm thinking about, even for that small chapter that's about self-representation, that will focus on the making of this film. Thank you.
Aubrey, your question answered. Any other question from any other person at this stage? Okay, then it looks like everyone is very happy with everything. It was extremely interesting. Aubrey got another question. Aubrey, is it a legacy hand or a new hand?
No, this is a new one. I lowered the first one. Thank you. Don't you think of considering entering at the film festival?
Yes.
Because that would also, open up audience for you.
Yeah, no, we definitely are, we're now working with a film student to help with some of the editing and, things that that are complicated. I will say one of the biggest, just to go back to Martina's question, one of the absolute biggest challenges about this, as probably would be obvious, but is just the infrastructural challenges of making a film in a refugee camp where, they had never made a film. So even though they had film advisor and whatnot, there are all kinds of things that went wrong. And one of the things was on the film shoot. So this is to get to your question about the festival, I promise. But during the film shoot, they had gotten from Nairobi a hard drive. It turns out that hard drive didn't work. And so we were doing the filming and, we had no hard drive. Fortunately, from the US, I had brought a hard drive, a small pen drive that had a lot of space and was old. And I just said, take this because it, get rid of all my stuff. We'll put it on my computer and take this one because this one from Nairobi is not working and we're going to lose everything. What turns out, so they got that, they started editing from that with the computers that they had access to. And then after they had a limited time with these film advisors. But of course, a film takes much longer. Then they had no computer. Then they had no editing software. And I had to do my work in trying to get them from the US a computer, 2 computers. It took months. It was unbelievable how long for something, and just sort of the recognition, which is obvious, but in real time, it becomes much more poignant that, these infrastructural challenges and inequalities that are built into the the world that we live in, was glaring, to the point where filmmakers here could not believe that they had this hard drive. So the hard drive that I had, after some time, started failing. And we did one showing of the film in Nairobi, and they said, this hard drive, they hadn't saved it anywhere. I quickly made a Vimeo account. We quickly uploaded the film to Vimeo. And then the hard drive that I had given them started collapsing, in part because some of the people on the team started bootlegging a bunch of films from, popular films onto that hard drive, and it just couldn't handle it all. So they have been doing the editing without raw footage, which is just like, people here at Bard say they would have just given up, but they didn't give up, and they've made a film. And they did it with what they could. We finally got them computers. We got them editing software. So that, Martina, was, I guess, one of the more big challenges. But film festivals, we are definitely hoping for. We want to get it into a place that feels like it can be, some of the technical things will not be distracting, technical problems.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward to that, definitely. Any other question? Because we are running over nearly at time. So I think I would thank you very much for a wonderful session. You got us all thinking.